start working through this. And one thing you're going to notice is a lot of repetition. I think we covered some of the instruments last week. We covered some of the basics here last week, but there's a few other things I wanted to cover. The first of all, actually, I'm going to read a little bit here, I'm going to read 8 through 13, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion, and then make our way through that, depending on how you guys want to cover it and what you want to talk about here. So, for this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. The first thing to keep in mind as we go through this is the Chaldeans could have been a couple different types of people. We've seen them earlier on as kind of sages and people related to that, but there's also a population of Chaldeans that existed southeast of the Babylonians. I think they're also southeast of the Judeans as well. And they existed as far back as Abraham. If you guys remember what we said about Abraham, where he was from. You guys remember where Abraham was from? What's that?
Ur of the Chaldees, right?
Yeah, Ur of the Chaldeans. Yeah, so he was part of that, and so we know that group, and that was of course during the time of the original Babylonian Empire. Since then, we now have the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and that's what we're talking about here. We never refer to it. Well, not very regularly do we refer to it as Neo-Babylonian, but that's what we are. I guess in our vernacular today, it could be Babylonian 2.0, but that's what we're dealing with here with Nebuchadnezzar and his. In his empire at this time. Anyways, they brought charges against the Jews. Look at a few things here. They refer to them as the Jews, and it's kind of not clear if it's all Jews or just the Jews that we're about to see, who are leaders or officials. Because remember that we had Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were all, of course, Jewish officials, but there are probably several other Jewish officials that we never really even talk about or read about or see about. Now, you'll see them outside in other texts from the ancient Near East text. You'll see these other Jewish leaders. But here, specifically in this story, we really only focus on these 4. So they responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, "O king, live forever." We've learned that if you don't respond to the king in that way, you're typically going to get killed. Or some sort of severe or dire punishment. So he always would address the king in that regard, or something to that effect. "You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image." So we talked about all these instruments last week, and what a horrible sounding orchestra this probably was. And how it was mainly, based on how it's written here, how it's most likely probably just thrown together and wasn't really a orchestra as we like to think of as like a symphony type orchestra, which was something that'd be pleasant to listen to. This was probably to the author's point of what he's trying to do here when he was writing this, is to make it sound like it was disorganized and not very good and just kind of chaotic. And that's what he's trying to set Nebuchadnezzar up as. Not a, he did not like Nebuchadnezzar. The author of this book did not like Nebuchadnezzar, and he's trying to put a little bit of Jewish anti-Nebuchadnezzarism into this, if that's such a word. Verse 11, "But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." This verse, verse 11 there, freaked out our 14-year-old when he was like 4 or 5 years old for years, it seemed. He would talk about throwing people in the fiery furnace. Not in a mean way, but if someone upset him, he's like, "I'm going to throw you into the fiery furnace," because he heard about the fiery furnace. And he also did not want to get thrown into the fiery furnace, so he tried to behave. 3 or 4 years old when he read about this, it was kind of a funny thing. And so he'd always make reference to the fiery furnace, and doesn't seem to be afraid of it anymore, unfortunately. But at that point in life, he was. Verse 12. "There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up." So these Chaldeans, what are they attempting to do here?
Well, see, they're probably
angry at the fact that these Jews, these are exiles, whereas they were natural-born citizens.
Right.
And so you've got these outsiders who were placed above you.
Right.
So they probably had targets on their backs most of the time.
Right. Yeah. And what had happened just recently after the King's Dream, right? After the King's Dream was interpreted,
Well,
they're set up even higher.
promotions.
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
it's
even
like,
before that, in the very first chapter, when we were reading too, that they were the best at, you know, he promoted them because they were the best of all the.
They were the best of the best.
Yeah.
yep. They were, yeah. They went to the school, they did well, and
Yes.
were promoted for it. Yep. One thing so they're just jumping back up to verse 8. This is how much fun Hebrew is. The word is, so brought charges or denounce. It's a kul kareshon is the word, and it actually means eat the pieces. So put that together and think about what brought charges means. So if you think about eat the pieces is kind of pointing towards, some people would believe it's pointing towards Daniel in the lion's den, which we'll eventually read about. And so it's a similar sort of word that is brought up against Daniel, as in he will be eaten to pieces by the lions, which we know, of course, that does not happen. So it's just interesting usage here. I don't think anyone would ever read that as it came forward and eat the pieces or eat to pieces against the Jews, but that's actually what it's saying here. So just interesting, some interesting usage. You got to remember that there were not a lot of Hebrew words. There are probably 8,000 to 10,000 of them, and so they had to use them as creatively as they possibly could to get a point across. And this was one case where that seemed like that. What else do you notice in here?
Well, one thing I read was they said that apparently that Nebuchadnezzar was a tyrant both from a religious standpoint, in that, you know, you have to serve his gods, or really himself, you know, and then I'm sure that he put away people politically, so to keep a stronghold over his empire, he needed this blazing furnace. This isn't something he just fired up every now and then, is kind of what I gathered.
Right.
That this was used often to execute people.
Yeah, it wasn't just a random or very seldom thing he did. It was pretty regularly. And I think we talked last week a little bit about it, that it was probably also the same furnace they used to build that, the very statue that was just built.
The smelter.
Yeah, as a smelter for that.
My commentary Bible says that there's a good possibility that the statue itself was based on his dream, and to try to show people that he was better than God, he built it solid gold.
Yeah, just because the head being gold wasn't enough. He wanted the entire.
He wanted to show you that I'm going to last forever.
Yeah, which we know didn't happen. So it's all right. Jump down to verse 12. So one thing you have to think is these guys were constantly on guard for their lives. It wasn't like now we've been promoted to this higher level of status where these officials who've been given all this power. They were constantly on guard of someone coming behind them or backstabbing them or saying, "Hey, these guys are not, as we see here, bowing down to your image, O great king. Let's go kill them." So they were constantly having to worry about that. It's kind of similar to, if we want to take it back to the story of Queen Esther. Even though she was thought of as the king as being the most beautiful wife that he had, and of course making her queen, at the end of the day she was still Jewish, and she still had to worry about what could possibly happen to her, because once they found out she was Jewish, it could be really bad for her, because of course they did not like Jewish people. And so she did everything she possibly could, of course, to not give away that she was Jewish until the very last minute, knowing that what would happen if she did admit to that. So a similar sort of thing. She was always kind of on edge, of knowing that if they ever find out or if they ever decide to go against me, they have all the rights to do that. And the same we have here with our 3 friends that are listed there in verse 12. Before we jump over anything else, well, go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
Daniel's name is not mentioned. Was he just kind of out of town at that time? This was going on, or
There were some people who say he was.
or was
He
not
left.
targeted at this time? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, some people have said that he left. He had left town or was not in the area at this time. I have seen some commentaries on that. Others say he just wasn't part of the story at this point, and so just didn't cover it as just part of the story. So it's just
The
kind of.
charges may not have been brought against him because he was much higher ranked than these guys.
He was, but he wasn't bowing either, though. So
That's all right, but
You
these
never
guys
know.
may have been a little fearful about,
yeah,
careful whose toes I step on.
it could
I'll
it
take
could
out
have
his
been.
buddies, but
Yeah,
if I go that far and it turns against me, I'm the one in the furnace and I know it.
right. Yeah, I mean it could be, but then again, whenever you get to him in the lion's den, I mean, yeah, it could go.
That was before he got really
Right.
pumped up again.
You're right. That's true. Yeah, I know. It's one of those things where when the Bible's silent on it, we can make some assumptions, but they aren't really too clear about it.
Just got a quick question for you.
Uh-huh.
We know that these 4 gentlemen were anointed by God, and that's why they got the special dispensation that they had. How do you think the rest of the Jewish community was treated?
So I've seen a little bit on it. A lot of them kind of just lived their lives for the most part, kind of under the radar. Because I think maybe it was the first week we talked a little bit about it, when these guys were forced to eat the Babylonian food, and then they went to the eunuch and said, "Hey, how about let us just eat vegetables?" The commentary and some of the history around that would say that, well, the people who were actually just living in society were able to keep a lot of their kosher laws and didn't have to deal with that sort of thing. So they weren't getting forced into it as much as, say, the officials were.
So you think this threat of fiery furnace didn't apply to them,
Well,
the general Jewish public?
it gets very specific here whenever it says the Jews, as in the Jewish officials. So it gets pretty specific, but at the same time, it could have been others as
I
well.
think there was persecution going on.
Oh yeah, I don't doubt that.
I think the furnace was what day in and day out.
Okay.
It's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean
Their
it's
version of the cow.
Yeah.
yeah, it's again, it's one of those things where it's not a lot of evidence on it, but it's very possible. Just knowing the history and the craziness of Nebuchadnezzar could have actually been very possible. So.
The other history we read as it goes along with this is the history is happening in Israel right now, so you don't get a picture of what was happening to the Jews in Babylon at this time.
Right. Yeah. You know, it's not as clear.
From other scriptures I'm referring to. It doesn't refer to the persecution that was going on in Babylon.
Right, and you can get a little bit of it post-exile. So the persecution that was going on post-exile, in some of the prophets. Well, that's not post-exile, but if you look at like Nehemiah and Ezra, you can see kind of an idea of some of the persecution that's going on, because they forced them from building the wall, and then you can't build the wall, you can't build the wall, you can't build the wall. As people kind of that was an oppression side of things. But you're right, the day-to-day detail you didn't see a lot of.
You get the day-to-day detail what was happening in Israel, but not with the ones that are in Babylon. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. One thing that before we go on here is something that the king has to be aware of is what the people are doing, the Chaldeans are doing to them, what are doing to the king, is they're kind of painting them in the corner, right? Because if they say that you, O great king, has made this decree, if you make a decree, can a king back out on it? No. So they're setting him up to say, oh, well, to realize that even if he liked these 3 guys, and even if maybe they're not bowing to this image, well, he still has to throw them in the furnace because he can't back out on a decree, which gets a little bit more interesting here at the end of the chapter, but because he makes another decree, but we'll look at that when we get to that point. Who wants to read? If someone wants to read 13 through 16, let's go through there.
Then in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? Now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every other kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I made. But if you don't worship it, you will immediately be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power? 1 through 16?
No, you're good. Just right through there is good. What's the king trying to do here? What do you guys think he's trying to do?
Give him a second chance.
Yeah.
Yeah, why do you think he's trying to give him a second chance?
Because he likes them.
He probably does, right? They're probably doing a good job, making a little bit extra money. They're keeping the Jewish people from revolting and doing what they're supposed to do. So he gives them or tries to give them a separate chance here.
It's kind of curious that he's in a furious rage during all this.
Why do you think he was in a rage?
He's being set up.
He's being set up. He's being set up by the Chaldeans, right?
It's like, oh, come on, guys, really?
Yep.
And so he tries to get out of that vow that he made.
Yeah.
By giving them a
Another
second
chance. Yeah. Because he typically would not be the guy to give people second chances,
Yeah.
and he does. He does here. So we can kind of see him trying to get them out of it, but also in verse 14. So he's trying to make sure they're clear. It's like almost like, are you sure you actually understand what's going on here? It's kind of a feel I get from that. And then he just repeats everything that we've already said, that he's already said up to this point. But the interesting part is that at the end of verse 15, and this is where it kind of sets apart his arrogance of who he is, of who he thinks he is, as in maybe thinking of himself as his own deity, because there's no God. I read it as there's no God who is more powerful than me, and they can't save you from this anyways. And so, what do you guys think about that when you see that there into verse 15?
Just what you said. He's all powerful.
Mm-hmm.
He's omnipotent, and there's no quote unquote God that can stand up to him.
But yeah, exactly. But then if you go back to chapter 2, verse 47,
But he has a short memory.
he has a very short memory. Yeah. Now we don't know if Daniel was promoted and then the next day the king's image was he built it. I mean, it had to be over a period of time. But yeah, still, it's a pretty short memory of what he has here and what he's thinking of.
I think we were talking here just last week. We said that he was impetuous. He would just grab something and go with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And what you think he's doing here is that he's no longer at the end of verse 15 saying, this is me and you, me against you. He is pretty much kind of throwing the gauntlet down against God. Like, okay, now it's me and God. I'm going to go against your God, or any God for that matter. And I think that's part of what he's doing here as well, is to be able to show that difference between the two. Let's jump into 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. What stands out to you of what they do not do when they speak? And we don't know if they all speak at once or if they have one person who speaks at this point.
Time to live forever.
Yeah.
They tell them to live forever, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty. Yeah, exactly. That's pretty brave and gutsy to be able to say that, O king, do not live forever. They're just come out and say what they want to say. And like I said, we don't know if they had a spokesperson among the three or they just kind of knew at once they were going to say it together. But we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. So a very bold statement that happens. And so they're shifting kind of any hope that Nebuchadnezzar's sane enough to ever let them go to putting all of their hope in God and their God at this point. And they continue to say that, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. You guys remember the graphic we put up last week of the Greek Orthodox painting, and it had the hymn that was written that the Greek Orthodox still sing? That's what this 17 and 18 is that kind of that hymn is a redo of this. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So even if their God does not save them, they are still not going to worship Nebuchadnezzar God or worship Nebuchadnezzar or the image that he's set up. So that's, again, similar to if you went back to Esther 4:16. What is she? We did Esther, what, 3 or 4 weeks ago in Sunday school? What is the thing that she finally comes to a realization? It takes Mordecai a couple times to talk to her back and forth between, they never actually talk directly, it's the eunuch and others going between the two. But what does she finally come to the realization that these guys have come to the realization of? You guys remember what she finally realizes?
I perish, I perish.
She perishes, she perishes. If it's over, it's over. I am not going to give up what I believe in. And even though she knows, and these guys know that their lives may not be spared, they're still doing the right thing. So it's a similar sort of story here. And I just could not imagine having to face that. That would be extremely hard. And but that's something that she faced, and something that these three are facing, that no matter what, they're doing the right thing. All right. Let's see how Nebuchadnezzar responds to that. If someone wants to read 19 through 23, we'll go through that.
Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace.
Thank you. All right. So Nebuchadnezzar, what do we see here? He is extremely upset with them right now. And I think part of that is arrogance, also embarrassment, and probably a little bit of sadness tied into that too, that he's having to toss his 3 friends in there, or 3 officials in there. And it may be hard for us to...
I'm not saying long live the king sort of thing.
Yeah.
May not have been...
May not be the right thing to do, right?
Yeah. Okay, heat it up and throw them in.
Why would the author put 7 times more than it was usually heated? What's the significance of 7?
Yeah.
What was that, Gene?
Completion.
Completion, right? You can't get it any hotter. It's an extreme amount of heat, which is just kind of shows how much of a maniac this guy was. Because I mean, fire it for the most part any temperature. You guys could argue this would kill you, right? This is probably, I mean, this literally pulverizes anyone who would.
Well, he shows he wasn't really too smart if he used his strongest soldiers to tie them up and take them to the furnace.
Why do you think he did that? Because you got to think, these are 3 guys who are not armed. They're not fighting. It's not like they're trying to fight this guy or fight this. Why would he do that?
I think he thought he was showing his power.
Yeah.
Showing his power. I think it's showing his power, but also his weakness of not really being too sure about if he is that powerful. And so let me just show you how powerful I am, and to do that, I think there's a couple
Maybe
things
he thought
going on.
if God was going to deliver them, he thought that they would be able to just bust through the ties and take out, take out the soldiers rather than just let them sit in the furnace and be like toasty.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, it's hard to tell, but I think he's trying to show his power, but the same. Yeah.
I think there's a physical thing there too.
Okay, go ahead.
Them guys didn't walk in on their own; they were thrown in.
Well,
So you had to have
They were
a pretty powerful
Well,
guy
they
to
fell in
throw them in.
because-
Fell in.
I've seen some commentaries on that, but I've also seen that they willingly went in. And because of the way the Hebrew here is written here, because when it says in verse 23, fell into the midst of the furnace, it's a similar sort of similar word that he uses whenever he says people should bow down to the statue, the golden statue. It's the same word. So it's almost like they fell in a worship-like posture whenever they fell into the furnace, is how some people have read the Hebrew there. So it's you kind of wonder there. But you've got to think, no matter how willing they were going to do, to your point, did they really? I mean, there had to be some pushback, right? You'd think, but you never know. But again, like I said, the usage here for fell into is more of a falling into a worship-like posture into the fire.
Well, obviously, they had to have fallen into the furnace because it said it killed all the soldiers because they got too close to fire.
Mm-hmm.
So if they were dead already, by the time they could get close enough to the fire to throw them in, they were dead.
Yeah, no, it's
So they had to go in on their own.
It's also more descriptive than other areas too, so it's not leaving much room to the imagination in terms of, you know, some of the other stories you hear, things that might get glossed over that just leave, you know, this is pretty cut and dry as to
Right.
what happened too.
Yeah.
So it shows the importance of it.
Well, I think Nebuchadnezzar was just adding insult to injury. His attitude changed about him because they wouldn't worship him like he wanted him to. And it's kind of like kicking a dog when you're down. It's kind of just like, I'll show you.
right.
And he was just trying to do whatever he could to make them feel as bad as they possibly could. So he sent his biggest guys
Yeah,
to intimidate them.
yeah. So part of it, yeah. I think
It's
it
part
again
of the
goes to
psychological,
yeah.
you know.
Yep. Yeah, I think that all kind of ties in there. All right, let's go from 24 through 27. Nebuchadnezzar here gets a little bit of a surprise. So we're going to get the king's perspective of what's going on here. Also notice here that, before we go into that, and this kind of goes back to how they went in, there's no sign of real struggle, and there's also no sign of them saying anything to the king. And maybe that was the author just keeping that out to make them look brave. I doubt that was it. Or maybe they just thought that they're doing what God has called them to do, and they are going to do what needs to happen, and away they go. But it's just interesting that nothing is said here. And then so from 24, we get Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. And Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men loose and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like the son of the gods." That leads to kind of a, not a controversial, but a significant amount of discussion about who the son of the gods is, and we'll talk about it here in a second. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace, which is interesting because it's so hot it killed his soldiers, but I'm not sure how near he came. But if you remember last week, the way we were talking about it is, it was probably shaped like what we'd think of as a beehive shape. And there was a spot on top in which they probably fell into, but there was also a viewing side as well. And so maybe he's walking up to that. It's not clear, but anyways, I found it interesting that he's able to walk up to it, or at least came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants, and see what happens here." He changes his view again of the Most High God. So based on what you're seeing is probably not quite Yahweh, but something pretty close to that. So he's looking at them as their God. "And come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. And then we get all of the officials, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. It's an extreme, wonderful miracle for them. Who is the? So let's talk about this. Who is the 4th person that you think he saw in there?
Could be an angel, or it could be pre-incarnate Son of God.
Yep, could be.
But I don't know. I don't have an opinion.
There's debates on both sides of that. Some people say it was Gabriel, which was like the angel of fire, and but it wasn't. And so that you'd say it's Gabriel, the angel of fire, which could have been. But then you take it. Some people have taken it even further and said, yeah, okay, it was Gabriel, but it was not his righteousness that saved the 3. It was their righteousness that saved Gabriel from burning up.
Oh, boy.
I know. I'm just giving you their thoughts on it. It's
Yeah,
good to
yeah,
hear
yeah.
other thoughts, right?
Hanging out with
But
your
clearly it's
Catholic
got to be
family,
from
you
heaven,
know?
you know?
Oh, what's that?
Clearly it's got to be someone from heaven. Got to be a
Yeah.
heavenly
Oh, it's a
person.
heavenly body. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No doubt about that.
What
Yeah.
could it be, that God would minister an angel to give comfort to the three?
It could have been.
Why would he be there?
That's the big question because it doesn't say why he was there.
No, Lord.
Right. Right. So, like it says it looks like, well, this is his viewpoint, right? Where it says, well, yeah, it's literally Nebuchadnezzar's viewpoint there in verse 25. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. So he's the one who is seeing this. And so, okay, so Nebuchadnezzar's viewpoint, he's not thinking of Gabriel the angel. He's not thinking of Jesus, certainly, or any sort of Jewish Messiah.
Yeah.
So he could be thinking of the maybe some of the lesser gods, the pantheon of gods that they believe in,
Yeah.
possibly too. But then again, what happens? He changes his viewpoint in verse 26, where he now recognizes the Jewish God as the Most High God. So he's not quite monotheistic here, but he's making his way in that general direction, but he's not quite there yet. So, as you can imagine, he is probably quite a deal to know that you threw three people who were supposed to, for the most part, burn up immediately, and now they are walking around with the fourth. That could probably freak about anyone out. They are loose, and then whenever they finally come out, there's only three of them that come out. So the angel, son of God, however you want to depict it, divine being leaves, and they come out and they are fine. And everyone witnesses this. So it's one of those things that's kind of interesting, is that it's not just the king and a few other people who see it. That's a significant amount of people that are in verse 27 who sees and witnesses that these three men, Jewish officials, have made it out of the fiery furnace. I imagine none of them have witnessed anything like this before. And so it's quite a deal for this group of people to see that.
I always get the idea that, okay, if you back way up, the three are thrown into the furnace, and this has likely happened many times, and so, it's like, well, that's the end of them, but yet something must have been going on. Possibly they were talking, possibly they were singing. I'm talking about the three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Oh, okay.
Because why would he leap to his feet in amazement? I mean, he did, and it said, and he looked into the furnace.
Oh,
So,
you're saying
you see
typically
what
they
I'm
would
saying?
just throw people in and walk away because
Yeah,
they've
just
done
walk
this
away.
before.
I mean,
Yeah.
just like a factory process.
Like a
you know.
sporting event too. Almost,
Yeah, I
something
mean,
like the
but-
Romans.
Huh.
I mean, something must have happened, says, for him to leap to his feet in
There were 4
amazement.
people there.
Yeah, but to Richard's point is this has become such a common thing that why would they even stick around and watch it? Because they're just
He wanted to see them because they got through just telling him off, basically.
okay. I could see that, or he had some sort of care for them, or it's more to him than just a typical everyday person. These were
May the kings live forever aspect of it was just enough that, all right, I'm gonna watch you die.
it could have been that
I gotta remember,
kind of a
I
revenge.
gotta remember what little kids do with big bonfires. They throw stuff in there
Yeah.
and they watch it
Watch it
burn.
burn.
Just watch it burn, right?
You know, that's.
Big kids do that too.
they could-
Yeah, I was gonna say,
You know,
guilty
so
as charged.
I'm sure what Nebuchadnezzar was expecting is the beehive furnace like you suggest.
Yeah,
The ball usually kills them.
right.
As they just lay in a lump at the bottom and they burn up. Okay, hey, that's pretty cool.
hmm
But now the fall didn't kill them, the fire didn't kill them, and they're walking around with this fourth god.
Yeah, it's just
But the point,
it's been
You know,
as
so
I
it's like
see
this.
it was about Nebuchadnezzar's God versus the Jewish God.
right.
And so if he's got that going, I'm gonna sit there and watch just to make sure that their God doesn't come out.
I want to see how this turns out.
Okay.
Well, they had already told them that their God could save them.
Okay,
So
yeah.
you have to watch and see.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's see if your God will save you.
Well, then you had to have the portal somehow on the side of the beehive because I mean,
Yeah.
For him to see it.
it says he leaped to his feet, so he must have been sitting there able to look in.
Right. Yeah, and that's how I've seen the design of it, and they would
The
watch.
fireplace is hot
Yeah,
in front of the fireplace.
right.
It's much hotter at the top of the chimney.
Yeah, which is where they came
Giant
into.
chimney.
Yeah,
That's all, basically, was the concept of
Yeah.
giant chimney. And
Yeah.
if he took them in from the top, that's the reason it was so much hotter up there for
Okay.
those guys.
Yeah,
And he could get close enough to it down here. It's hot,
yeah.
but it's not as hot because it's drawing that direction.
Oh, good point. Okay, yeah. All right. One thing I wanted to cover with the when he says most verse 26, Most High God. We're going to take that as he's referring to the Jewish God, and that's what most people would take that to be, at least nowadays, from kind of a more of a monotheistic viewpoint. And as, of course, as a universal authority. Now, the pagans like him would take it as somewhat of universal authority, but probably just the highest God of all the gods. So there's almost two different conversations going here. So you could take that to be most high of God of all gods versus the Jewish people saying just ending it at the most high God. And we'll cover a little bit more of that here closer to the end when he makes his new decree, but just some things to think about for that. All right. Any other thoughts on those before we wrap up the last 3 verses of this one?
I guess
So,
Matthew,
just a question.
Kind of go back into chapter 2.
Yes, sir.
This is after that rescue, looked at God of gods, but he hadn't actually said Most High God, so he just acquiesced that there was a God.
Where are you referencing to? In yeah, I mean in 47 we have the God of
46 and 47
Yeah.
said, your God is indeed God of gods. And so Nebuchadnezzar was polytheistic, right? He had a whole host of gods.
He did.
And so back in chapter 2, he's recognizing Jehovah God as being among the gods. But now that he sees this, he says, okay, now he's Most High God, so he's elevated
Right.
a little bit.
We would call that a henotheist.
Yeah.
So you have the high God, and then you have, but you still believe in other gods. So henotheist is what
So it's,
that'd be looking.
you know, now that he's seen this, he's sort of elevated our God one more step.
Yeah, when we're up, yeah, looking good. Yeah.
So he hasn't given up polytheism yet. He's just the Most High God.
He doesn't quite. I don't think he ever quite gives it up. Even in the next chapter.
Yeah, he keeps marching down this path, though.
Yeah, he's getting there. He's getting there. We'll talk about that in the next chapter a little bit too.
So did we get to 28 yet?
Yes, sir. We are about to.
Okay.
How would you like to read 28?
I'll read it for
Okay.
you. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own.
Okay. What are your thoughts on that?
In the Babylonian religion,
Mm-hmm.
they had gods. Did they have angels? Because Nebuchadnezzar recognized the fourth person as an angel. Sent.
Yeah.
That's my translation anyhow.
No, it's
somebody
mine
else
too.
might not
Yeah.
have
No.
angel.
Did anyone else not have angel? I think everyone probably.
Yeah,
Angel.
I've got ESV.
Yeah.
How would he recognize an angel if in the Babylonian religion they don't have angels? He identified him as an angel.
Yeah, that's a big question. You kind of wonder if the author added that as
Yeah.
part of it, or an editor added that as for clarity for the people who are hearing it the first time. I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, could you see that, or do you think
I think
maybe he knew of angels, or
No, he reiterated the term angel.
yeah, yeah,
So where did he get that from? I have no idea.
yeah.
Another mystery.
It is, because he kind of gives an idea of Well, first of all, look what he does here. He doesn't admit yet that this is his God or anything related to his God. So he talks about the Most High God in 26, but now he refers to him as the God of these three, which is, he probably forgot their Jewish names, but he refers to them, their God, their Jewish God, but using their Babylonian names. Some people have a lot of conversation they like to have about that, about why he did it that way, but here or there, it is the Jewish God that he's referring to.
Well, if you get down to it,
Yep.
the first commandment says, you shall have no other gods before me.
Right.
So God is saying, you may have gods, but they're not higher than I am.
Well, that's the point he's trying to make through the whole time. The author is trying to
Yeah.
writing that into the entire.
That's the whole reason they stood their ground was
You know,
because
he's looking at it from a secular point as
Right.
being the highest God, but he's still recognizing it is the highest God. There's no other God before him.
Yep. Yeah. Oh no.
He
Yeah.
is supreme.
He's getting there.
Yeah.
He's getting there. Like I said, he's a
that was the whole problem, is that they were very familiar with the law, the three, Shadrach and all, and so therefore they were not going to bow down to him and his law, and so therefore even in the answer that he gave, that we don't need to answer you because they're not going to bow down to him.
Right.
They were familiar with the law of you shall not have any other gods other than him, and so that to me is they knew what they stood for. It was a no-brainer for them. And I love the whole thing where it says, but if not, it's in full submission.
Yeah.
It's just there. That's what the author to me is saying in this whole chapter is it's just full submission. And even when you fully submit, Jesus will be there to bring you out of the fire, out of the trials.
Yeah, I agree, and I think if we take it a little bit further to the idolatry, they can't do the idolatry. But also, if you take it earlier on into the book. The way they would only eat kosher meals, and the other things they would not do along the way. And the reason that is because they were separated. The entire time they want to be a separate people, to be set apart. And so that's, again, continues on through this.
But to kind of get back to his word, Nebuchadnezzar comes back and says he has sent his angel. I find that so interesting because I kind of read into this that the fourth person was God. I mean, it was Jesus, it was God, and even Nebuchadnezzar doesn't even recognize the God. It was like he sent somebody to protect them. No, that was God that was down there protecting them first.
See, Nebuchadnezzar comes from the mindset of a king.
Yeah.
And a king would never go in and do his own dirty work. He always sends his people. So in his mind, the God couldn't possibly come and do it. The God sent his people. At one place he referred to him as he looks like a son of the gods, and in this place he says an angel. But basically, it's God sending his people to take care of it. Because God
or
wouldn't
some
come down.
divine being
Right.
that is being walked.
It's one of those things where there's just a lot of debate. It is someone who's divine, who God sent. Now, is it the Messiah Jesus as we know it? It could be, but it's unclear.
It doesn't say.
It doesn't say. Now, if you look at sons of God, if you go back to Genesis and you go some of the other texts earlier on, you'll see references to sons of God, and there's debate about, is the sons of God in that case an angel? Is it someone from the divine council, which is something that we'll talk a little bit more again in chapter 4. The divine council that you see in Job and then you see in other books as well, there's volumes and volumes are written of who is this divine council that God is referring to, or that is referred to in some of these books. And most of the time it's angelic beings, but then there's just debates because there's just so many missing pieces to help us to fully put that together. And I think that's part of that is the mystery that we talked about, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, the mystery of revelation, that God will provide that mystery. He provided it through prophets. He provided it through some of what we see in the New Testament. But there's still a lot of mystery that we don't know yet. And that will be the revelation that God will provide. Most likely not until the end of time as we know it, but that revelation and that mystery will be opened up. And I imagine we'll see things that we could never possibly imagine or understand at this point. But it'll be amazing. All right, let's finish this one up. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue this is, again, remember last week, sorry, I stopped. Last week we talked about the Tower of Babel and what happened with the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel, then everyone had to take off all their different directions with their different languages. This is a reference back to that. That was, of course, Old Babylon. We're now Neo-Babylon. But he's made this point before that all people, nations, and men of every language that live on the earth may your peace abound. So he is looking at everything that's happened since the Tower of Babel, but also kind of showing how he believes that he is the sovereign over pretty much what he knows as the entire world. Contrasting to that God is actually, the Jewish God is actually sovereign over the entire world, which he's going to kind of figure out in the next chapter. This is pushing towards that whenever he makes a decree like that. So he doesn't stop his other decree. He doesn't say, my other decree is now over about bowing to this golden image. However, I am going to make another decree, and this is going to be for, of course, for these people who, well, let's read it. Anyone that speaks of anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb. We've seen other people who possibly be torn limb from limb earlier on, when it was those folks who were not able to interpret his first dream. He likes apparently to tear people from limb to limb. And their house is reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. So again, he is still polytheistic. There are other gods, but none of them are as powerful as this God. Then the king used Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. So their prosperity continues. The Chaldeans failed in their attempt to try to kill these three Jewish officials, and these three begin to prosper, and great things happen for them as far as we know. So, any thoughts on this before we go into chapter 4?
It's one of my favorite
Isn't that great?
in the
Yeah.
Bible.
We could probably spend a whole lot more time on it, word for word, but it's powerful of showing us who God is and who we are.
Well, for me personally, it's exciting because I do believe in the pre-incarnate appearance of Christ before he actually was born. And this is just one of three that I can think of.
Yeah. No, I don't ever want to take away from that possibility because I think it's there, but I think it's good to explore other options too.
Well, you might
without
recall
taking it away from
when
it.
Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, they kept trying to pin him down. You know, he was talking about how long he had been around. And finally he said, before Moses, I am.
Before Abraham.
Or was it Abraham?
Yeah,
I
before
am.
Abraham was, I am.
I am.
And they picked up stones.
yeah.
They couldn't handle that.
Yeah.
I mean, he, he made it clear, that's how when Moses asked God, who should I, when you say that, I'm here to free my people, they say, well, and which God was that? Tell him I am.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, you go
And
all
that's
the way
who
back to the
Jesus
beginning of
was
time. Yeah.
referring to also. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, it's good. All right, let's move on to chapter 4. We'll try to knock some of this out this evening. This is where we think Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges God. Well, he does acknowledge God, but he's still not 100% there. So we see where this king who thinks that he's sovereign actually comes face to face with a sovereign king. Anyone like to read the first 3 verses here?
To the nations of peoples in every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation.
Does this sound like Nebuchadnezzar?
No,
He's
not
kind of
really.
getting there.
He's getting there, but kind of not.
No, it doesn't sound like him at all.
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, this is the beginning of a public letter. This is an epistle that he's writing that will be interrupted, and then he'll come back later on to finish it up. But if you look at the format and the context of this, he is writing this as a very typical. Some people say it's more Persian than Babylonian, but version of a letter. So the beginning of a letter of what he's writing here to the people who are reading this probably for the first time, or at least hearing it for the first time.
If this is shortly after watching somebody walk out of a fiery furnace, he might be a little bit on his tiptoes thinking, I better score some points while I can.
So that's the question: is he writing this letter to? Is this an immediate letter that he's writing right after, and he's trying to not make up, but continue this new decree that he has?
I'm a little fearful of this God now. I see how strong he is.
And let's all kind of get on board here, so we don't get struck by lightning or whatever it is that they're worried about.
The only thing that sounds like Nebuchadnezzar to me is where he says, "The wonders that the Most High God has performed for me." He made it about himself. And that's typical of Nebuchadnezzar, but that's the only part of that whole
Exactly.
thing that seems like Nebuchadnezzar. He did this for me.
It's still about him.
It sounds a little like Psalms in a way, doesn't it?
The chapters 4 and 5 are the whole letter, and this is just the introduction to that letter.
So 1 through 3 is the beginning of the letter, and then
And then it's a narrative that ends up at
Yes.
the end of chapter 5.
right, and so
So is this just the beginning of the whole narrative?
it's the beginning. Well, it's a letter, and then a narrative, and then we get Daniel's interpretation, and then the letter comes back in chapter 4. But then, chapter 5 will continue because actually at the end of chapter 4, we really don't see Nebuchadnezzar again, because if you look at chapter 5, we start talking about the next king, Belshazzar.
Yeah, so it's the end of, it's the end of 4.
Yep.
So all of 4 might be just one narrative.
Yep, and so 36 of chapter 4 is when the letter continues and ends in 37. Is
Okay, that might be.
what I've seen. When we get there, we'll talk more about it, but that's the evidence that I've seen on that. I don't think we'll get that far this week, so we can dig a little bit deeper into it, but yeah.
So you have to be careful about inspired notes and study Bibles, but there's some thoughts about 4:1 through 4:3. Does it belong to chapter 3 or does it belong to chapter 4?
Okay, so yes, so that's based on the idea of it being Masoretic text,
Yeah.
and so the Masoretes would have looked at this as still being part of chapter 3. Our versions, I think everyone in your probably version is probably starting in chapter 4 with the beginning of
So
letter.
if it was 4, then all of 4 becomes, in my mind, the narrative. This is the introduction to that narrative, and you get this narrative and you get
Okay.
conclusion at the end of it.
Yeah. So absolutely. You could look at it that way, and I believe that's how the Masoretes did it. In some of the commentaries that you see on this, you'll see the Masorete chapter and verses, and then you'll see what we typically see with chapters and verses, and they're usually off by about 4 or 5 verses. It's the same text, but they've put it, like to your point, this is the end of chapter 3. We haven't started chapter 4 yet.
Well, then, I'm just saying, just acknowledging that there is a discussion about where does it belong. I kind of like it at the beginning of chapter 4.
Yeah.
Because then next 4, an introduction, a narrative, and a conclusion.
Oh, yeah.
And that fits nicely in my way of thinking.
No, I agree. I think I find it to be a little bit easier. When I read the Masorete version of it, I agree, it isn't, in my view, but then again, I've always been reading the non-Masorete version. It flows better this way, but there's a reason they did it their way, and again, it's textually, it's pretty much the same. They change a few things, they don't change what it's saying, they just change some of the structure of it. And so that's part of what we're seeing with that. So I believe if we were doing this right, well, according to their viewpoint, 4:4 would actually be 4:1 in our version.
I
So
like ours better.
I do too. I have a version of it, in the Masoretic version of it I could bring next week, and I'll read that version, and we'll really confuse people. Right? We'll just be off by 4 or 5 verses every time I say something.
They may have broken it up too, to break away from all the disasters that were declared on people, and then present his response, which was his conclusion
Mm-hmm.
to what happened at the furnace.
Yeah.
But it's by breaking it chapter for us learning about it.
Yeah.
It stops you, instead of saying, well, he went from this guy's getting ready to slaughter everybody that says anything bad, to having a heart for God,
Yeah.
for at least at that moment.
Yeah, I think there could be that logic could be placed too. Some things to think about whenever he writes about, and this, so if you look about, okay, we'll because of the references I'm about to make at the beginning of chapter 4 versus the end of chapter 3, if you look at 3:29, and then you look at what he's saying there in chapter 4, verse 1, he's still bringing in all the people, nations, and men of every language, maybe men of every tongue. He's bringing again that in because that viewpoint that he has of who he believes his empire is, he still believes that he's not always quite there yet until the end of this chapter with fully acknowledging God. Like I said, he's henotheistic, so he knows that there's this very most high God, universal God, but not fully.
His pride still showing goodness.
His pride absolutely is still showing. Yeah, it shows through most of this, especially how he explains his tree and everything. Let's see here. Do we want to do that? All right, let's, unless there's any thoughts on 1 through 3, let's do 4 through, let's start working on 4 through 9 and get some discussion on that. And as we go through this, so one thing to think in mind before we read that, even though he's killing people in fiery furnaces and tearing them from limb to limb, his empire for the most part is relatively peaceful at this point. The Egyptians are pretty much under control. No one is trying to attack him or trying to really unseat him from being a king. And so he's in relatively a time of peace and prosperity here in the Babylonian world. And part of that is what we're going to read into when we start reading his dream. Especially he believes that they're in a time of prosperity and a time of peace. Now, you'd have to imagine the Jewish folks were probably not as much certain of that, of being in a place of peace and prosperity, but in his viewpoint, they were. But let's do that. If someone wants to read 4 through 9, we'll discuss a little bit about that one.
Nebuchadnezzar was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, and I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here's my dream interpreted for me.
All right. Just one other thing to think about here. Some people would say this is probably about 30 years after he had interpreted the original dream. So he has done pretty well for himself over the last 30 years. Mainly that he's still alive, and mainly that Nebuchadnezzar's talking to him. So he's been around, and we're probably about 30 years later from the original dream, based on some of the context that some historians have taken from this. But as you see there in verse 4, he admits to himself about how great everything is, how there's ease in his house, everything's flourishing in his palace. It's never been so good before in the world of Nebuchadnezzar, based on his viewpoint. But then he has this horrible dream, and it's very much similar to the last dream, and this made me fearful, and then these fantasies and everything that he had just kind of really knocked him out from his view of being such a wonderful ease in his house and the flourishing of his palace. He has this horrible dream. So for the most part, kind of ruined his happy state that he was in at that point. And so he does what he typically likes to do. He gave the orders to bring in the presence of all the wise men. So these would be everyone that we had listed earlier on, and that we'll see here in verse 7, because he wants the interpretation of the dream. Now the fun part of this, which is different from the last dream, is that he's not going to make them figure it out. He's actually going to tell them it. So that's one bonus for these guys. Notice that what's interesting is that in verse 8, Daniel finally comes in. So it's kind of interesting. So you have in verse 7, you have the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. They came in and related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to Nebuchadnezzar. They probably tried in many different ways, but they're probably, for the most part, were afraid of saying anything wrong. So they probably just said nothing at all. They know that they will not be able to answer that question. But then finally Daniel comes in there. And you kind of wonder, why did he come in late? I mean, he could have showed up with the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners, and all those people. Now, we don't have any satraps, governors, or any other government officials. Mainly we have our magic people and mystics. But they bring in, he finally comes in there in verse 8. Why do you think he waits? There's some debates or conversation about why he waits to come in.
Maybe to point out to Belshazzar that he's kind of a slow learner. That you try all these guys before and they never were able to do anything.
Yeah.
And through God's grace, I've been able to tell you the answer. So go ahead and try them all again. You're going to find the same result.
Yeah. No, I think that's a big part of it. He's just kind of waiting for them to mess up again. Yep. Or show that they're incompetent.
Maybe he's just not as readily available, because if he's made him a governor of somewhere, it doesn't necessarily mean he's right next door, where all these other astrologers and whatnot might be right next door or in his presence.
Maybe he's
quicker to summon.
Working on another committee meeting down the hallway and it's waiting. Show later. Possibly.
The assistant to the man.
I think he was just trying to wait to, this is my viewpoint, he's just trying to see what these other guys would try to pull up and just see them not be able to do it again, because they're not going to be using his God again. They're all still missing the point, and that Nebuchadnezzar pulls these guys in still shows that no matter what he just said earlier on in chapter 4 about this Most High God, he's still not fully there yet. And one reason we see this is if you look, as we go into verse 8, he first of all refers to them as Daniel, but then he refers to him as Belshazzar, which is another name for the head pagan Babylonian god Marduk. Mm-hmm. So now he's, so why is he doing that? Is it because he's just trying to, make sure that he's covering all his bases?
Well, Daniel wrote this, and he might have been trying to make clear to folks, I, Daniel, did this. He called me Belshazzar.
Well, I know. Well, right, but it's if the king is speaking this.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the author
I'm saying that the author came back when he wrote it down.
Kind of switched it up a little bit to make it.
His version might have swapped it just a little bit, saying, "Be clear that I didn't put me down as Belshazzar. That's what he calls me."
I don't know, possibly. But okay, before we go much further with that, the Spirit of the Holy God, so who the Spirit of the Holy Gods speak through him. So Nebuchadnezzar thinks, in my view, is that it's not just the Most High God that he's talked about earlier. He thinks that all gods speak through him. Do you guys see that or get that as possibly what's going on here? He's trying to cover everything.
Yeah.
And in him, whom is a spirit of the holy gods, and I related the dream to him.
Either way, I think he sees Daniel as different.
Oh, yeah.
Even though he calls him the great magician, I
Yep.
think he sees him as different than his other magicians, and I'm just wondering if he summoned him at a different time or under different circumstances. So he got there later than the other ones as he was fooling around with these guys. It's like, give me Daniel,
Right.
type of thing.
So he's the head magician. Though he's a high up official over many things, he's also considered to be the head magician too. So possibly
I
set
don't know.
those other guys in. Yes,
In
ma'am.
their culture, they were very prejudicial, and he was still a Jew,
Mhm.
and the others may not have been. And so the protocol may have been that they went to their own first.
Okay.
I mean, that's just
Could
kind of.
have been.
Could have been.
Yes,
Yeah.
knowing how prejudicial societies operate,
Yeah.
you know.
Fortunately, not anymore,
So-
but yeah, back then
Yeah.
it did. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they probably still resented Daniel for the most part because
Well,
they
you've
would
got
have never
to.
considered him one of them.
Right. And plus, he had all the power, and they didn't, and they were upset about that.
So they didn't run together.
No, I bet they weren't hanging out, at the water cooler. Or,
There's Daniel over here and then all these other guys over there.
Yeah.
There's Democrats over there talking about him.
all right. I'm not going there. Okay. No, you're,
Didn't either.
okay. In verse 9, O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you. So we see this kind of more beyond just a regular human capacity. If the spirit of the holy gods is in you, so there's a divine capacity here that he's admitting to. And no mystery. So this mystery goes to revelation. So it's not just, it's God's revelation. It's not just a mystery as in a mystery novel. This is God's revelation. He knows that God can reveal things through Daniel. Tell me the visions of my dream which I have seen along with its interpretation. So he really sets Belshazzar or Daniel up to be the one who can do this, and he admits why he can, kind of. He admits it as in he knows that the gods speak through him, not just the Most High God, but he knows that there's something special about what Daniel can do. And of course, obviously that is since he's been doing it for the last 30 years or so. So as we go into this, we start going into the interpretation of the dream. And it said, now these were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth. Remember, there's other trees in the Bible, and one of them was in Genesis, so we'll probably talk about that here in a second. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth. You may have a different one. You may have midst of the land. There's some debate about really what the right word is for that because of it could mean multiple things. And its height was great. Think of the Tower of Babel. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelled in its branches, and all the living creatures fed themselves from it. There are several things happening here of what. So if we believe this. One thing we can believe this to be, this is one thing I want to bring up, is this is God giving him this dream. Can we kind of go with that? Is that consistent? Okay.
Yes.
So God is giving, so the holy Jewish God, the God of Daniel, is giving him this dream. So think about that from that context as you look through this, what this tree is supposed to be, and what the tree symbolizes and what it is doing or was supposed to be doing, and contrast it possibly with what it was not doing. So who was the tree? Nebuchadnezzar's a tree, right?
Well, Dale explains it later, so.
Thanks. Just give it all away now. Yeah. So yes, Nebuchadnezzar.
Spoiler alert.
Well, thanks. Well, we're done for the night, and
The
so
tree is his empire.
okay, yeah. There's it starts with the empire, and then it transitions to him
Right.
and what he
Well,
is.
he
Yeah.
is the trunk of the tree according to what it is, but the tree itself growing so large is his empire is spread out
Exactly.
over everything.
Yeah, and if you
he
look at
controls the known world or his known world at the moment.
Yes. And who, going back to who has land versus earth in their, anyone? It's where it stretches over the land instead of the earth?
Mine says the middle of the land.
Okay.
Tree
Some would say
middle.
that's a reference to the Garden of Eden,
Yeah, mine says middle of the land also.
middle of the land. So it's stretching beyond just the current Babylonian border. We could look at it that way. The reference, some would say the reference to the center of the earth points back to Genesis 2:9 in the Garden of Eden. And then, of course, the reaching it to, the, like I said, remember the Tower of Babel, that reach to the heavens or the great height is a reference back to Genesis 11:1-9, related to the Tower of Babel. So just kind of bringing some past Babylonian symbolism, or even well beyond that, beginning of time, symbolism into this. And so this very powerful tree grew and became strong, and it did all these things. But I think what we're missing, what is setting it up is that as a king, the idea would be that all kings were supposed to be representatives of God. They were supposed to be, pretty much, yeah, like I said, his representatives here on earth. And if Nebuchadnezzar was placed there by God, as we see in the Bible that there's authorities are placed by God, they are supposed to represent God. But we know that many authorities, many rulers, kings, prime ministers, presidents, you name it, don't always do that, right? And so they are given this huge, wonderful opportunity to do what he's supposed to do, to be able to provide, to have this beautiful community that's abundant to feed everyone, that keeps shade and protects everyone, and helps people thrive and grow. That's what we're seeing there in verses 11 and 12 of what this is supposed to be doing. And we're going to get the contrast to that here in a second. So we see that happening. Do you guys see how that's what he's trying to do here, what the author is trying to do through the interpretation or the description of the dream, of what's being seen here? Any thoughts on that? Any more thoughts on that?
He's already making himself pretty important by the way it's written out, as far as everything's wonderful, I'm in charge. Everything's going well until the next few verses.
Right.
The scary side of the dream, but right now, he's having dreams pumping himself up pretty good.
He is.
He's saying, I'm all sufficient.
He is. He's supposed to be the sovereign, right? And he thinks he is. That's how he's interpreting it, but that's not what God is trying to tell him, right?
I understand.
Yeah. No. Yeah. But that's what Nebuchadnezzar thinks, is that look at this great kingdom I have. I've done all these wonderful things. It's flourishing. People love me. I'm taking care of things the way I should be. But of course, it's the exact opposite is what's happening here. And then we have this. Okay. I have 4 minutes. I'm sorry. Can we stop there? Because
Sure.
as this next section, we get really interesting because,
Oh, you can interpret it in 4
Leave
minutes.
us on
Come
a
on.
cliffhanger.
Huh?
Leave us on a cliffhanger.
yeah, because the watcher is.
So we watched him go.
Oh, we can't stop now.
No, we had
Come
it.
back
We
Yeah.
gotta go.
That's-
We gotta
yeah.
get it.
Let's all go home and study the Watcher.
This is a classic
let's cover
critique
it.
sandwich. Good, bad, good. It's like,
See, your students don't wanna leave, do they?
But I've got to pick up my daughter.
Oh, okay.
And stuff. So let's finish there, and we'll start back up at verse 13 next week, and finish up chapter 4, and wrap up our good time with Nebuchadnezzar.